First item I want to call up here is item number 45 that was pulled. Again, this is an item that we're going to move to postpone for 2 weeks. And I appreciate the council's indulgence as hopefully we try to narrow issues. As people are leaving the hall, if you could please keep it quiet so we can keep moving, I would appreciate it. Mr. Kassar, this is your motion. Before I call down the chief, I want to give you an opportunity if you want to speak now or you can speak later, whatever you'd prefer.
No, I appreciate the opportunity for us to ask some folks some questions here today and to continue to clarify what we learned at work session. I think that it is important for us to have the conversation, and what I gleaned from work session is that it is unanimous across the council that nobody wants to repeal or change rules in a way that endangers public health or safety in any way. That really the goal and the intent is to try to not perpetuate having criminal ordinances, to having criminal penalties to behavior that isn't creating any health or safety issue. And so I look forward to really diving in on that, because I just think that is all of our intent, and I hope and look forward to us landing in that place on the 20th, and I think today will help. Okay,
thank you. Colleagues, I've handed out on the dais a draft amendment that has been handed out to some of the stakeholders. I'm going to ask Mr. McGill on my staff to go ahead and post it so that it's up on the message board for people to see. And it's my intent to talk about that for just a second, and then to bring down Chief Manley as a resource witness to talk with me about that. And then we're going to invite some people to come down by way of panel to talk about what it is that we're talking about. I think, and then we, of course, have with us all of the staff members that intersect with this that are also available here for resource. But the intent today is not to talk through the issue, to decide what the right answers are or are not, more than anything else, it's to narrow the issue. Because as I go around the city and as I have been in TV studios and with radio stations, talk to the community, I think there are a lot of people in the community that are concerned that these ordinances might impact our ability to be able to police affirmatively public safety threats and public health threats. And I think that the purpose of today's conversation is to really make sure that we true up what it is that we're talking about, as well as to make sure that what we're doing, in fact, has that intended result. So at a really high level, I want to thank Councilmember Kassar for working with our office on this amendment. I know you haven't signed off on it yet, but I appreciate you helping us try to do what we're trying to accomplish. The stakeholders that will be testifying, I appreciate their involvement again, not committing to anything in particular, but have helped us in my office try to get it to this place, and as well as DAA and the police chief and the APA folks that we've talked to about this as well. This is how I look at it, and it makes sense to me, and maybe it'll make sense to people in the community. There are three buckets that, at least three, but three buckets of impacts that arise associated with folks that are experiencing homelessness. The first bucket are those things that call into question and are threats to public safety. Touching somebody, aggressively harassing somebody, threatening somebody, either causing or threatening physical, public safety kinds of harm. I think it's important that whatever we do doesn't take away a tool for a police officer that is facing or confronting probable cause for someone that is threatening public safety. We don't want to do anything that impedes their ability to be able to act when they see that or would ordinarily address that. The second bucket is the public health issues. You know, if someone is urinating or defecating on our streets, if someone's giving rise to a public health challenge, we want our enforcement folks to be able to act, and we don't want to do anything that takes away their ability to be able to act. And we need for people in the community to tell us if we're not accomplishing that by this, so that we can fix it and make sure that we are. Because we want to move past conversations about whether we're impacting our ability to deal with public safety threat or a public health threat. Because the intent is not to do that, we need to make sure we are. But there is also a third bucket. And the third bucket is really what this community should be talking about. It is the more difficult issue. But unless we get past the first two, we're not going to actually have the conversation we need in the community on the third. And the third one is, what do we do when we're dealing with someone who's experiencing homelessness but is not presenting a public safety issue or a public health issue? It could be somebody who is sitting in front of a restaurant who is dealing with personal demons and talking and speaking in a way that the rest of us cannot understand. It could be somebody that hasn't bathed in a long time. They are there. And they are not presenting any measure of public safety issue, and they are not presenting a threat to public health. What do we do in that case? And part of the question that we have as a council is, do we want our police to arrest that person? Is that something that we say is a criminal thing? That's at one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is if we have a street like Congress Avenue, where it may be wide enough to put a tent. Do we want to put a tent, have someone able to put a tent on Congress Avenue outside a restaurant where someone at the window of the restaurant's looking out and seeing that? And the owner of the restaurant says, please make that person move. They're not threatening anyone's public safety. They're not presenting under this hypothetical, they're not presenting a public health risk. But what do we do in that case? The ultimate question for us, and manager, I think for you and for the strategy officer, is going to be to help us come up with what is it that is our city's response to that kind of situation. It is not the intent for today's meeting and panel to decide the answer to that question. It's only to make sure, as best we can in the community and on social media, that we are not talking about the first bucket, we're not talking about the second bucket. Let's have an honest conversation in this community about the third bucket. And the question we have is, with today's conversation, my hope is to be able to move us to that third bucket so that we have that conversation. Councilmember Kitchen?
Thank you, Mayor. I think, not that we need to talk about this now, but part of that third bucket is item 49, and that's shelter. We've had lots of conversations so far, and that's not the item in front of us right this minute, so I'll just say one thing, and that is that ultimately the end game is the solution to homelessness is housing. But we can have that conversation again and again and later also.
And I think you're right. And it may involve us having conversations about creating areas where people can camp or creating areas where people can park. I mean, there are lots of solutions for that, not for our conversations today, but let's move people to the place where everybody recognizes that's what we're trying to address. What I have handed out to people that I know you do not have a copy of, but the people who are testifying have seen this or discussed this, is taking the amendment that Councilmember Kassar had posted with respect to camping and sit-lie, and adding to it words that appear in the state ordinance, the state statute 42.03 of the Penal Code. So it's taking language that Mr. Kassar's draft amendment had, where he had intentionally or knowingly impeding the use of public property, making usage of the public property unreasonably inconvenient. That was still actionable for an officer to intervene, but it's adding some words to it. So it says not only intentionally, knowingly, but adding recklessly, because that's in the state statute. And where it says impeding the use of public property, we add the words or rendering impassable, because that's also in the state code. And then making usage of the public property unreasonably inconvenient, we have added to that or hazardous. So it would read, what's actionable in both camping and in sit-lie is intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly impeding or rendering impassable the use of public property, making usage of the public property unreasonably inconvenient or hazardous. That's the first group of 3 amendments. And yes, Mr. Starr?
And Mayor, I do want to state that that those are fine, entirely fine with me. It reflects exactly what I think the sponsor's intent was, which was to try to mirror state law in a way that is not discriminatory towards people based on their income or whether they have housing or not, but that is really about a behavior. And so those, to me, were the original intent, but it seems to just make it more closely mirror state law. So these are
great. Thank you. I appreciate that. The second thing concerns the solicitation ordinance. So we have an ordinance right now that makes actionable aggressive solicitation. And your original amendment, Councilmember Cassar, had us just repealing that section. And there is good reason to appeal it because probably it's unconstitutional, which makes for a good reason. And the reason that it's potentially unconstitutional is because we can't control speech. So you can't make someone can be arrested for aggressively coming up and asking for money when it's not against the law to aggressively come up to someone and try to proposition them, say. So one way to deal with that is just to erase the section. Another way to deal with it, which is what is in the amendment that I think has now been posted onto the message board for people to see, or about to be, what it does is it takes the solicitation ordinance and turns it into an aggressive confrontation ordinance. And basically everywhere it said to aggressively solicit, it now says to aggressively confront. Because it's the aggressive behavior, not the actual words, that really is what is of people's concern. So it takes that ordinance and it just really substituted aggressive confrontation everywhere it said aggressive solicit. It also takes out the per se section. There were some sections where, under the old statute, where it was violation to solicit, even in a non-aggressive manner in certain places. And that section's taken out, like next to an ATM. That's taken out now, where the only thing that's actionable is the aggressive behavior, regardless of the message associated with that. We're throwing it out there as something for the community to consider over the next week. We'll work with the stakeholders and everybody involved. There's an issue with that I think we'll discuss with Chief here in just a second, that's obviously a vague ordinance to some degree. Presents some issues of that, but it certainly presents no greater issue on that than what the existing ordinance does. And it's been our ordinance on the books. We've been defending that ordinance and should continue to be able to defend this ordinance the same way we defended the existing ordinance. So it was those 2 changes that are on this amendment. And my hope is that if we consider this amendment or things like this, that we can reassure the community that we're not doing anything to take away any tools for someone that is probable cause exists to believe that they are creating a public safety issue or a public health issue. We're only talking about that third category, which is what do we do when someone is not presenting those issues? What do we do as a community? Councilor Cassar?
And for this set of changing the solicitation ordinance to be about being aggressive versus about being poor, I think you're aligning with the intent of what it is we've worked on. This is the first time that I'm actually looking at the words, so we can keep considering it. But I think in the end, from what I'm hearing, your intent on this, it doesn't change the intent, but it might reassure people. Some folks might say it's duplicative based on the conversation we had at work session, saying we already, of course, should be able to stop someone if they are propositioning someone or if they're asking somebody for their address instead of asking them for money. But in the end, I see the value, the potential value in reassuring people. I hear some of the same questions you've asked, but in the end, I think it sounds like we're all rowing in the same general direction. We have to just figure out how to do it.
And I appreciate that. I appreciate that too. The point of this, again, we have a really important conversation to have as a community. What do we do with the folks that are experiencing homelessness that are not doing a criminal or public health thing? What do we do as a community? Obviously, we're doing some things, as Councilmember Kitchen pointed out, and today we're doing some, increasing shelter area. What do we do holistically? But that's the conversation we should have. And as a community, we should demand of ourselves that we don't let this devolve into a conversation about public safety risks or public health risks. That's not what we're talking about. We don't need to organize people on those issues. What we really need to do is have a serious conversation about the third bucket. That's the purpose of this. Chief Manley, do you want to come down for a second? And we'll work through these panels as quickly as we can, since we're not deciding anything today and we're voting to postpone this, and then we can get to the other items that were pulled.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
So could you give us an idea who all is going to be speaking? That'll help us know when to ask our questions.
Okay, so the intent is to have Chief Manley kind of give us an overview of this and speak to the issues that I raised. Then we're going to pull just some people down for the center area here. We're going to call some service providers, give them a chance to comment on the bucket issue if they want to. Someone from ECHO, someone from Mobile Loaves and Fishes, someone from Austin Interfaith. Then we have the opportunity for folks from the business community, downtown community, that have also helped us engage in this issue. We've given opportunity for DAA to be here. We've given opportunity for the Police Association to be here as well. We also have then a third group that would be the civil justice advocates, grassroots leadership, Texas Fair Defense. We also invited someone that could speak to the lived experience of being homeless in our city, and it's just that. It's just those three groups real fast, and then obviously our staff is here in case council has any questions. Chief, can you help us try to focus what the community conversation is we need to have?
Certainly. Good morning, Mayor, Council Manager, Brian Manley, Chief of Police. I think that the way you've kind of framed the discussion and a lot of what's been occurring in the community dialogue has been probably about the extremes on either end. The extreme being those situations where we have someone that is aggressively maybe touching someone or is committing acts in public, whether it be defecating, urinating, or other types of conduct that we do have other laws on the books to address. So the ordinances will not necessarily impact our opportunities in those areas to go in and make that area safe because we have other tools that we can use, as well as the discussion that's been talking about arrests and using all of these tools to arrest the homelessness issue. To the point when we talked earlier, when you were posing the question, Mr. Mayor, about do we want the police to still have the opportunity to arrest in these circumstances? So much of what we do does not involve arrest. So much of what we do, actually, we get voluntary compliance. We have data that shows through an initiative we're doing in the downtown area where we have officers working overtime on the homelessness issues. We're getting voluntary compliance 98% of the time, and this is on a data set over 8,000 interactions where the officer goes up to that individual who we have either received a complaint on or that we have seen potentially violating one of these ordinances, and we've gained voluntary compliance. The other things that we have also available to us is that it's not an immediate arrest. It may be an emergency detention if it's that person that is in a mental health crisis, and we go out and our officers determine that the appropriate course is getting them into a treatment center. It may be the host team coming over and aligning them with services. So the arrest is really very, very minimal number of occurrences, and I have data that I can provide, but I know that today's not the day to go through all that. But the number of arrests that we make for these three ordinances compared to the time in which we encounter it and all the other actions we take really is minimal. What this really, in my opinion, at this point, the issue that we have to address is what are the community expectations in the direction of this council for your police department when we get those calls that we will get because either a resident or a visitor to our community perceives that their safety has been jeopardized, feels like they are not safe for whatever reason, based upon either someone violating one of these ordinances, sitting and lying in front of a business that they have to go past to get into that business, or if you're enjoying an outside cafe and they've pitched a tent right on the other side of the fence and they're hanging out their laundry and it was not the experience that that resident or that visitor had planned for their evening that night, do you want your police department to be able to go in and address that situation, or is that the standard that we want to address? I think a couple of the other issues as far as what's been written into the ordinances, one of the changes by adding culpable mental states is something that we would have to address within these ordinances when we could potentially end up in a court if we've made actions under this. The previous ordinances did not require a mental state, a culpable mental state, which is a legal standard. And so it could be that if we're interacting with someone who is highly under the influence of alcohol or drugs, or someone who is intoxicated, that we have to achieve that burden of proof in a court of law that they had the capacity to exhibit that culpable mental state. And the other change is that the ordinances initially made the act itself the violation. The mere fact that you were sitting and lying in violation of the ordinance, or the fact that you had camped in violation of those parameters set out in the ordinance were the violation. With the new language of that the violation has to create a circumstance that is now hazardous or dangerous, these are, again, thresholds that we would have to now establish to take legal action. And so much of what we do, we garner through that voluntary compliance, and that might be impacted, likely would be impacted with higher thresholds, because officers might, without the tools to enforce, would be less likely to seek that voluntary compliance. So again, to sum it up, Mr. Mayor, I think the issue that we have to talk about is what are the community's expectations and what standard are we going to set as a community for those types of interactions when people perceive that their safety has been jeopardized or they don't feel safe based on something that legally we may not believe rises to the threshold of a hazard or a danger.
Okay, I think that's helpful. If I could just parse that for just a second in conversation with you. I think it's really important that you identify for the community that arrests are few and far between. We're just not that many, and you have the numbers associated with those, and over time those arrests are going down. Is that right?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, it is.
You've also identified for me that sometimes when folks get arrested who are experiencing homelessness, they get arrested, they're told to appear before a magistrate or judge later, and a significant number do not, and then a warrant then issues for their arrest. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
So one of the issues that we need to talk about is both the numbers of arrests and noting that they're coming down, but also how that interacts with warrants then being issued that then have warrants out for people's arrests and that kind of thing. So I think that's, you've tagged for us an important thing for us to talk about associated with this, and thank you for that. Mm-hmm. What about the three buckets? I want to make sure that my understanding is that the first bucket, which is when a police officer has probable cause or believes that somebody is threatening public safety or committing an act in violation of public safety, that what's being proposed in these amendments does not, the police officer that's seeing that violation or acting on that, there are no tools that are being taken away. You still have the tools to be able to address somebody where you see probable cause associated with actively doing something about public safety.
Correct. If there's a threat to public safety, then we have other ordinances or laws that we could use to impact that specific incident.
Okay. And I say that because it's really important that in our conversations we want the community to recognize we're not compromising that at all by this. What about public health? That's the second bucket. It's true, is it not, Chief, that what we're doing here that still enables the police to act on things that they believe rise to the probable cause level of a public health safety issue. Is that correct?
Yes, the things that we typically deal with in that public health arena would be those issues of urinating or defecating in a public space, maybe drug use in open space, leaving needles around. So things like that we typically deal with, we would have other ordinances, other laws, if we were to actually observe the violation that we could use.
Okay. And with respect to that, in the state law, the culpability, the mental state that you referred to, the language that we now have made broader in this amendment by adding recklessly in addition to intentionally and knowingly, those are the mental states that are required by state law to be able to act on these kinds of things. Isn't that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So we're in accord with that. So really what we're talking about is the first bucket, the third bucket. And the third bucket is, what do we do when a business owner or someone calls the police and says there's a homeless person experiencing homeless outside my store. They're not putting anybody at risk. They're not threatening anybody. They're not creating a health hazard. They're not doing any of those things. Would you please move this person away? And the question is then, what do the police do in that instance? Under the existing statute, you have the ability to go in and say to that person who might be sitting there dealing with demons, you need to move. I'd appreciate you moving. Will you voluntarily move? I think you give them 30 minutes to move before you do anything. But ultimately, under the existing law, you have the ability to arrest that person who is not threatening anybody, not creating a public health. He's just there dealing with his personal demons. You have that tool to be able to arrest them. And that's what would be taken away. Is that correct?
Yes, if they met the definition of a violation under the current sit and lie ordinance, then we would have the ability to arrest even if they didn't pose that hazard or that danger as is proposed in the new language.
So really that's the question. What do we want our community response to be to someone who is not posing that risk or danger? But somebody is calling, or a police officer has seen where somebody's quality of life is being impacted, they feel, or they're having a perception of a public safety or a public health risk that the officer responding says, I don't believe that it rises to that level. What happens in that situation? And that's the debate I think our community needs to have. And if we could just focus on that, I think we'll have a better conversation. Anything else you want to add, Chief?
The only thing that I would add, just for consideration, I know there's a lot of work that's going to go into all of these issues involving our homeless community, as has there been for quite some time. As we craft and work through this space, we also have to recognize that there are individuals that are homeless by choice that don't want to live in possibly shelter that's been provided. And so we just have to make sure we keep that as part of the discussion, as well as how they would fold into everything that we're trying to do here.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have any questions on that before I go to the next place? Mayor Pro Tem?
Just a quick clarifying question. You mentioned that arrests were low, but what about tickets? Because I believe these are all ticketed offenses. So what is the, do you know the number of say, tickets this last year that were issued for any of these three that are being considered to be repealed or changed?
Certainly. So when we look at the cite and release data, so most of these, they're handled by cite and release with the promise to appear in court. And as the mayor pointed out earlier, that appearance is questionable at times as far as the rate. The data that I have shows when we look at the three ordinances that we're looking at today, in 2016, there were a total of 2,820 citations. In 2017, 2,576, and in 2018, 927.
And of those, do you have information that shows, because the problem isn't just about being arrested and having a warrant later for some reason, it's being ticketed and then not showing up to court and then getting a warrant. Do you have the numbers that show, for example, 2016, of those 208 and 820, how many of those turned into warrants because they didn't show up to court?
That information I don't have here. We might be able to pull that together. We'd obviously have to work with the courts and all of that to track where our arrest ended up in their system.
Okay.
Or our citation, I'm sorry.
I think that would be useful information if it's possible to get it, because that really is the barrier that we're trying, as Councilor McKitchen mentioned, it's housing that we're trying, that is really going to solve this issue. With the exceptions you gave, there are some people that will not seek that housing, but when you have a warrant on your record for a ticket because you were laying somewhere because you had nowhere else to lay, that could affect your ability to get housing.
And if I may, Mayor Pro Tem, just as a point for the discussion, these types of incidents, these Class C arrests, do not end up on an individual's criminal history. So if someone was to pull up your history, these are not going to show up.
Would a warrant show up?
If you run a warrant check, it will show up, but once you've handled the warrant, it's no longer a warrant. And so I know it's been talked about a lot that these impact someone's ability to get housing. These do not show up on a criminal history. Now, I think a lot of applications ask, have you ever been arrested before? And so the answer might be yes if you didn't handle this. But I think that's part of the larger community discussion where a lot of stakeholders need to weigh in and look at individuals' arrest records. And if the arrest is simply for these types of issues related to homelessness, then as a community, that's the solution. But oftentimes they're going to be accompanied by other violations that might be problematic for a renter or a lessor to want to open up housing for that person.
But you're saying an active warrant would not show up on somebody's criminal history?
No, if they've handled the warrant. An active warrant, so a criminal history is different than running someone for warrants. When we pull up a criminal history, it will give us a list of those things that they have been arrested and convicted for. If we run someone to check them for warrants, then that would show up. So yes, if we have an individual that has not handled their warrant and either gone and addressed it in the courts or been arrested and taken care of it, then that would show up. If they have, then it does not show up because it's not an active warrant anymore.
But would it show up if somebody is seeking housing and the person that's whatever on an application checking somebody's criminal history, not a police officer, would an active warrant show up on somebody's criminal history?
I'm not sure if the active warrant would show up on a criminal history because a criminal history is documenting your history. I don't believe that the warrant is going to show up on that, but let me confirm it because they're two different systems for two different purposes.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, yes, Sar, and then Councilmember Tovo.
Thank you for being here, Chief.
Yes, sir.
So what I got from the city attorney yesterday, and I think from the conversation with the mayor just now, I think lines up with some questions, but I want to be really explicit because I think folks have been asking really specific questions. So some people have said that folks sometimes get frighteningly accosted. Is it your understanding that with what we're discussing right now, if somebody is frighteningly accosted, APD could still criminally intervene?
Depending upon the level of the frightfulness and of the accosting, I mean, I'll try and use language. I think that's trying to be addressed in this aggressive confrontation ordinance. This is untested language. I'm not sure that courts have addressed confrontation before. And when the mayor referenced earlier that my beliefs were that this was vague, it's kind of in that lane. I think that we've got to look also at those times when there is protected speech, such as political rallies. I could see this type of conduct actually occurring where people are getting into each other's space. And so there might be some areas to make some improvements to make it less vague. But particularly what I'm looking at is the fact that the courts are really going to be the ones to make the determination of whether or not something is going to meet that threshold. Our officers will make the evaluation on scene, as we do all the time, whether something meets that threshold for arrest. But if we see the courts routinely strike down that arrest either through an acquittal or through not following through with charges, then what we're going to see is probably officers' less reliance on that, knowing that the courts have established that that's not usable.
Chief, let me ask this question another way. Let's put aside whether somebody's homeless or not, or asking for money or not, whether they're poor or not. Let's say that a person today frighteningly accosts someone and follows them and touches them, asking them not for money, but let's say asking them for their home address. Are you saying that APD can't intervene in that situation?
No, so you just added an element saying touching them. So if we have assault statutes on the books. So again, it depends on, these get very nuanced and very specific depending upon the conduct. As soon as someone makes contact that is offensive, then now you're looking at the assault statute.
So the idea being that if somebody is really threatening and aggressive without touching them, and APD sees somebody being really threatening and aggressive, asking somebody for their address, and let's say it's a person with money asking somebody else with plenty of money, are you saying that there is a point at which that aggression is sufficient for you to intervene?
Yes.
And the point being that any changes to this ordinance would not change that, so that if you are being so threatening that it doesn't matter the words that are coming out of your mouth, whether you're asking for money or asking for somebody's home address, that standard doesn't change. Once somebody is aggressive enough that you can intervene, the words shouldn't matter that are coming out of their mouth. It should be how aggressive that if they are being aggressive enough for you to intervene, you can still intervene.
The aggressiveness will be based on the behavior, not the speech, unless the speech is considered offensive by law, because then that brings in other statutes that we would look at under disorderly conduct potentially. But yes, to your point, I think what you're getting at is it's about the conduct more than the speech, but sometimes the speech may come into play if it violates other laws.
Understood. So frighteningly accosted is subjective, but if somebody is frighteningly accosted in a way that the APD says that actually isn't threatening, then you can't do anything whether they're asking, and under this, you couldn't do anything whether they're asking for money or asking for your address. But if somebody is actually aggressive enough that you would say that that is somebody truly being threatened, in this case, you can still intervene once they are threatening enough that you believe it's a criminal act.
Under the proposed ordinance, is that what you're discussing?
In either situation. Even right now, if somebody is very threatening and not asking for money, there's a point at which you can intervene.
Yes.
And the point being that would continue regardless of what we do.
Correct. The laws, regardless of what you do, the laws that are on the books today will exist other than these 3 ordinances that are under discussion.
And then some folks have asked whether or not anything we do here today would change the rules as far as people cursing or screaming at you. And my understanding is that if somebody is obscene or cursing or screaming at you, that we're not changing those rules. And so if somebody is cursing or screaming at you, asking for money or not asking for money, you would still be able to you'd still be able to criminally intervene if somebody is being threatening in that way.
Correct. We have statutes that address profane language and all that under disorderly conduct.
Right. Regardless of what it is that we do here, and that isn't changed or removed by what the mayor has laid out.
Correct.
And then finally, folks have asked the question about somebody following you with the intent to intimidate you or create a fear of imminent bodily harm. My sense is that regardless of what it is that we do here today, we aren't changing that. The fact of the matter is, if somebody right now is following you and creating fear of imminent bodily harm, that you can intervene.
We would intervene whether there are arrestable offenses. We would obviously intervene and put a stop to the behavior. Whether there would be action that we could take on the back end with the filing of charges or making an arrest would be determinant on specific actions taken during that encounter.
But the idea being that right now, if somebody is following you, and again, let's not even say that it's a person experiencing homelessness. Let's not even say it's a person asking you for money, but let's say it's a person with money, following somebody else with money, but asking them for their home address or as the mayor said, propositioning them, you can intervene. And no matter what it is that we do here, if somebody is following someone and creating fear of imminent bodily harm, you can intervene.
We would intervene, and we can, yes.
Yeah. So the difference that's being proposed, as the mayor laid out, is that if a person is sitting or lying down and isn't creating a public safety hazard, is not creating a health hazard, is not impeding public space in an unreasonable way, isn't breaking any of our rules as it relates to parks, isn't breaking any of our rules as it relates to trails, isn't breaking any of our rules as it relates to rec centers, isn't breaking any of those rules and isn't causing a problem, then in that case, you would not be able to have a criminal violation on that person in those instances.
Correct. If they're not breaking any of the established laws, but maybe they're impacting somebody else's sense of safety, they could call us because they feel less safe. And so really it becomes a quality of life issue for the individuals that feel less safe based on this behavior and what our enforcement opportunities would be.
Exactly. So if a person feels less safe and APD determines that there is an actual threat, then this wouldn't change that. But if a person feels less safe and APD determines this is not actually endangering health or safety, then that is what we're trying to balance here today.
Correct, council member.
Yeah, and I think that is a hard and real question we should be asking ourselves, and I appreciate us elevating that because we have to recognize that the people experiencing homelessness, just like people who are not, are all people here, and we have to sort of balance those needs and decide what is a criminal violation and what is not. And thank you for sort of walking me through that questioning because I think it's helpful for the community. You also mentioned mental health and public intoxication, and in those, none of these things would change that. You could still do a mental health, take somebody in for mental health issues based on the current state law, or for PI, you could still take them to the sobriety center. This isn't changing those things.
Correct.
Thank you.
Councilmember Tobel.
Thank you, Chief. I have several questions related to the data, and this is really more in line with the kind of information that I think would be helpful in the weeks ahead. In the question and answer, there are two different sets of information of the citation data, and I think, as I understand it, the first segment, which shows from 2014 to 2018, is the municipal court data, and then the next chart is the downtown Austin Community Court data. Is that why it's been broken up into two?
I apologize. I don't have the same data set in front of me, but I do know that you were provided with multiple data sets, and so that may be the point, because we each collect data at our level of contact. And as I mentioned earlier, the Downtown Austin Alliance has a set of data based on a program that they operate with us through overtime. We have data based on our officers on duty actions that they take, and then municipal court has data as far as how these cases process through their system.
So I guess I would suggest that in the week ahead, I think it would be useful to have all the data in one place, because, for example, some of the numbers that were being cited before, and I couldn't make them match the numbers that I have here. I think there was a number that was somewhere in the neighborhood of 900 or 800 citations offered, and it just doesn't match the two charts I have in front of me.
And if it works for you, council member, I can have a member of my staff reach out to a member of your staff, and we can maybe get these questions in writing, and then look at the data so that we can provide a response to everyone.
Sure.
If that meets your needs, I'm more than willing to do that.
Yes, and I would ask my colleagues to also think about that too. I mean, we're getting lots of questions about it, lots of questions about which way the numbers are trending, how many individuals are being arrested for these offenses, and I'd like to be able to answer those kinds of questions with confidence, and knowing that I'm looking at all of the information and not just the chart of those citations at the community court rather than those with the municipal court. I also want to just point the public to the question and answer also includes two charts, one of which shows where those citations are happening, and I think that's useful data, and also data that individuals have been looking for, so I appreciate that information. I want to make sure that I'm understanding the comments you made today. So you talked about I think you made a comment about the ordinance allowing for, well, I actually now can't remember your comment, and I wanted to be clear on whether you were talking about the Adler Amendment or the original ordinance that was brought forward by the co-sponsors. I think it had to do with being able to issue citations for aggressive confrontations. As I read the ordinance in our backup, there is not explicit, because it would be repealing that, you would be relying on other kinds of measures to enforce actions against aggressive confrontations. You'd be relying on assault charges or other kinds of charges.
With the proposed amendment that the mayor has put forward, the proposed ordinance that the mayor has put forward, looking at this being an aggressive confrontation versus an aggressive solicitation, this is something that we would look at. This may be an ordinance that we would use. Since it's new language, I was speaking to the vagueness of how would a court interpret a confrontation in a legal manner, and then whether or not that conduct that constituted that confrontation fit within other statutes that already exist. So this is new language. I think to your question, we might use this item put forward. Thank you. This ordinance put forward by the mayor under the appropriate circumstances, because that's what it was meant to address.
Okay, thank you. But that is a shift, and I think I appreciate the mayor. I think this is reflective of the conversation we had both in the work session as well as in the executive session, and I think addresses some of the concerns that I'd heard with the proposal that was in our backup. you also referred to you referred to something that I'd like you to explain again to be sure I understand it, and that was the data that you have related to how many times the officers are successful in achieving compliance from individuals. And I think you cited a stat that was quite high. I forgot what it is.
Yes, I can walk through that.
Was it 98%?
It was 98%, yes.
Could you make that data available to us as well?
Sure, and that's data that we've received from the Downtown Austin Alliance specific to the program that we're running through them, and these are overtime officers working in the downtown area, all with handheld devices tracking those interactions that we've had involving these ordinances, and then tracking the outcome of those interactions. And again, with that data showed that we had a 98% compliance rate. And we can provide that.
That would be super. And then could you restate for me what you were saying about how voluntary compliance could be impacted by a change in the ordinances?
Sure. So voluntary compliance comes about when an officer asks an individual to take an action. We're normally only going to ask an individual to take an action or to change their course or what they're doing if it's not legal or not appropriate. So if we change the underlying ordinances to where the conduct is only a violation, now if it is hazardous or if it is a danger to someone, the officer that gets that call from a person who says, I don't feel safe, this person is outside of my business, exhibiting A, B, or C conduct, they are less likely to ask that person to move along or to do whatever has been requested if they don't believe that it meets the underlying ordinance if it were to be changed in this manner, because we're only really asking people to voluntarily comply with the standard the community has set. So if we're going to change that standard, there will be far fewer circumstances where we would likely go in and ask someone to change their conduct.
Okay, thanks. I didn't catch all of that the first time through. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. And we'll work to kind of create some questions that will pull all the data into one spot.
Councilmember Kitchen.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to ask you some questions, and I want to thank the mayor and Councilmember Cassar too, and others. I think we're headed in the right direction. I also think that clarity is really important, so that we all understand what this does and doesn't do. And I'm focusing on the public safety aspect of it. So I wanted to turn some to the language here talks about hazardous, rendering public property unreasonably inconvenient or hazardous. So I want to talk specifically about circumstances that I want to drill down on how an officer determines what's hazardous, because what I'm seeing or hearing perhaps that I think we need some clarity on, and the public may need some clarity on, is particular circumstances that they may consider to be hazardous, but at this point in time, it appears that are not, there's no enforcement happening in those areas. And so I just want to drill down and understand, first, is that an accurate perception? And on the part of the public, and second, is that because of a difference in the consideration of what is hazardous, or is there some other reason? So I'm going to give you just one example, and then I don't want to run you through a lot of examples, but there are concrete situations that I think there may be some lack of understanding or confusion about that we need to understand. So, for example, in an area under an overpass that is in a median, or on medians and active areas under an overpass, where you have on the median both a sidewalk that people need to walk to is their only way to get underneath from one side of the overpass to another, and then you've got a median between lanes of traffic and between turnarounds. Fairly narrow medians. So there's a law right now about obstructing sidewalks. So my understanding is someone could not pitch a tent right in the middle of a sidewalk. That, I guess I'm asking you, would that be considered obstructing the sidewalk, which appears to still be covered by the language we're talking about here? But what about a situation where that crowds a person and crowds the person camping between two pretty active lanes of traffic. To my mind, I've seen places like that I would consider hazardous, both to the person who is camping or trying to have a place to be, both to that person and to someone trying to walk by. And so I haven't seen enforcement in those kinds of circumstances. And that may be that I'm missing something, so I'm wondering if you all, what your response is in those kinds of scenarios, and if there's any difference in how you would respond between what's being proposed and what you have right now. I think that what's important about what's being proposed is clarity, and it gives us an opportunity to clarify specifically what we're talking about when we're talking about hazardous or I'm using that term because that's the, endangerment too, because the other part of this is materially endangering the health or safety of themselves or of another person. So I want to understand what we mean by endangerment, what we mean by hazard, and want to make sure that we're clear. And then I think clarity means that we have to talk about examples of circumstances. So.
Mayor.
No.
Chief, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I know that you all have asked the manager to come back with a public document that we're going to draft that will have examples, specific scenarios in it. And rather than ask the chief to, on the fly, come up with an answer, if you don't mind, I would really suggest that it would be helpful for us to be able to come back with a document that will be public for everyone to see, so we can help answer some of these specific kind of scenarios.
Okay, well then I'll ask it differently, and I appreciate that. I think that for clarity's purpose, we do need to have those kinds of examples so people understand. But let me just ask what you do now. If you can just give a general kind of example, because we have laws on the books right now. So I'm trying to think of a way to ask that question that addresses what the city attorney is talking about. So for example, perhaps one way to get at that is the data that is being presented. There are some circumstances where there appear to be some, I don't know if that list is arrest under the no camping. Can you give us an example of what is possible and not possible, or what the police might consider something that's happening now?
Under the camping ordinance?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I would have to take you back to the parameters of the ordinance that talk about the things that constitute the violation, erecting the structure, breaking ground, doing all of those specific actions.
Okay.
Because what an officer has to be able to do is articulate that individual violated the elements of what the ordinance covers. So any example I give you would just be creating a situation where
That's
somebody
fair.
went and built a tent under those circumstances, or a shelter.
That's fair. I would just say that the no camping ordinance is not enforced in many parts of the area, and probably for a very good reason. But it's not, because people are living under bridges. So I think that, and I'm not suggesting one way or the other whether that is what we want to be having as a community or not. I'm just saying that it is the case. And so I think we need clarity on what circumstances these changes to the ordinance would impact and what they would not. And I think that that's really important, because we all need to be on the same page as a community to have the kind of conversations that the mayor has laid out, and I think that's the way to think about it. So I think with the, if I'm understanding correctly, what we are expecting to receive is specific examples and how this ordinance would apply in those examples. Am I understanding correctly?
That is our intent.
Okay, and that would be something that's made available for the public to see.
It is going to be a
course.
public document.
Okay, well then let me go on to a different question then. Let's see if I have. Oh, I wanted to ask about public health, and I don't know if that falls under APD or or if that falls under our public health department. So is there a scope of addressing public health that is APD, and is there a scope of addressing public health that's our public health department?
I think we would address violations that could be seen as a threat to the community health, but I think there are things that are outside of our purview as well, such as maybe disease promotion and camps and things like that are beyond our area of expertise.
Okay.
What we would look at is those types of conduct that do occur in these types of situations, and the ones that I mentioned earlier, kind of the low-hanging fruit, are such as the defecating and urinating in a public place, the drug use that may take place, which leaves residue in the area that residents or visitors would come across. So those could all be seen as threats to public and community health that we would have a role in, but I think there are other circumstances that there might be other divisions that are equipped to speak to and to handle.
Okay. Well, at some point, I'd like to have the conversation with our public health department. And I think that maybe falls in the second bucket that you had laid out about public safety, public health. So, well, then that's all the questions I have beyond just having specific examples, because again, as I said before, I think one of the things that is happening right now in our community is there's a lack of understanding, and sometimes there's confusion about what is an area that's, or not area, but what is that? What kind of conduct is appropriate for action, and what kind is not, and what the police have to see or not. And those kinds of things. I think that that's really important that we get down to that level of detail, because if we don't, we're going to pass something that we think addresses the situation, and it may or may not. And again, I'm simply talking about the two buckets. The first two buckets, as the mayor laid out, the public safety and the public health. So.
And I think to that end, I think those are all really good questions, and I think that is exactly what we need to figure out. What I want to make real clear to the public is we're not talking about any instances where the police officer arrives on the scene and says this is a threat to public safety. We're preserving to that officer all the things they can do. It's when they arrive on the scene for public health, they can proceed in all the things they can do. But the situation you're talking about is very real, and is what a lot of people in the community are talking about. It's where the officer, it does not rise in the officer's eyes to something that's created probable cause. What happens in that situation? Because we certainly have large parts of our community that are asking for conduct to happen. And what I don't want to do, and I think we'll get lost in the community and not end up in a good place, if the community thinks that we're undercutting an ability to be able to deal with a public safety violation that the officer sees, or a public health violation that the officer sees. If we can focus, as I think you're asking, for the conversation to concern that very real area that we need to find what our answers are, that last bucket.
Well, that's not what I understand that. I am trying to drill down on what the officer sees that's considered to be endangerment or hazardous. We need to understand what that is. I'm still firmly in the first bucket. And I understand there needs to be officer discretion, but we need to understand what those words mean, because we don't have a definition in here, and we don't have specific examples. So I think that as long as we can move towards a place where we get examples, so we all are on the same page in understanding what is hazardous and dangerous. I think that we need to understand.
I think that's very true. I think the point for today, though, is that what we're doing today is not changing the import of those words. Whatever endangerment means under the state statute as it exists today is what endangerment means tomorrow. Whatever hazardous means under the state statute today is what hazardous means tomorrow. It is real important for us to have a conversation about what does that mean and how are you applying that. I just want the community to know that by these amendments, we are not changing those standards. They exist before we do this. They exist after we do this. So that's a really important conversation to have. But just don't think that we're changing that by what we're doing here.
Okay, I got you. I'm not suggesting we're changing it, but I also am not suggesting that we're addressing it.
And over the next 2 weeks or next 2 years, we need to figure out how we address it.
How we address public safety, not the third bucket. I'm talking about hazardous stuff.
We can deal with all three of those. The important thing for the communicate, what this ordinance is going to, I understand what you're saying, and I think that's an important issue too. I just want the community to understand, because I'm getting a lot of emails and a lot of texts that are asking me that we're undercutting our ability in bucket 1 and bucket 2. And while there may be concerns with bucket 1 or bucket number 2, what we're doing here is not undercutting or changing any of the words that currently exist. We could decide we want to strengthen them or change them. That is certainly something we can talk about, but nothing we're doing here or that Mr. Kassar is proposing to do changes what currently exists.
And that's what I want to be sure of, and I think that's what I'm hearing. But it's also not fixing a problem.
I understand that too. This is an important conversation for us to have. And to that end, because I think I'm looking at texts and emails already, as concerned the solicitation ordinance, because there were a lot we talked about that. I again want to go back to the conversation. Are we changing anything? There may be concerns you have with the existing solicitation ordinance about how to apply it or not to apply it or where to apply it. Or I want, though, for everyone to understand that by changing the word solicitation to confront, whatever protections or guarantees were offered under the existing statute, we are continuing to offer those under the change statute, except that you no longer have to prove there was a solicitation. The aggressiveness is exactly the same. The standard for aggressiveness remains the same under what's being proposed. Good, bad, or indifferent, whatever you had to approve before, you have to approve now. The only change is you no longer have to prove a solicitation, you just prove a confrontation, which means that under the existing solicitation ordinance, where it says that it's illegal to intentionally make physical contact or touch a person, or to stand within 5 feet of the person after the person's asked for you to stop, or intentionally or blocking someone's ability to be able to leave, or using obscene or abusive language or gestures toward the person, or intending to doing something that is intended to or likely to cause a reasonable person to fear imminent bodily harm, all of those things stay in place exactly as they were before. The only change is you don't have to also prove there was a solicitation associated with it. You're just now going to have to prove what you had to prove before, which was that aggressive conduct. Isn't that correct?
That's my interpretation, Mr. Mayor, and I think maybe the city attorney would, from a legal perspective, would agree, but that's my interpretation of what you've written here.
Thank you. Councilmember Alter.
Thank you. Appreciate the conversation. It's a complicated set of issues, and I think it's really important that we really understand what's changing and moving forward, and, as well as the community. There's certainly some challenges with these ordinances that we need to address, but you made a comment, Chief, that I want to make sure that I understand. I'm not a lawyer, so I may be missing something important here, but I think for me, you made a comment, if you observe the violation, XYZ happens. And I'm trying to understand how that interplays with taking out or repealing ordinances or changing these ordinances, because it seems like there's a hierarchy of cascades, and what you could do now you won't be able to do later, even in a case where it was aggressive, because you could rely on the broader or the existing ordinance. And I'm just trying to understand that interplay, because you still, if you don't see the aggressive behavior, but you can see something else, you're able to act. And I'm just, there was a part of that comment that I feel like is relevant for understanding what we're doing, and I want to understand that better. So if you could elaborate on that, and then as appropriate, maybe Ann can put some stuff in the memo related to that, because there's this weird interplay, and I'm really not understanding how that works.
Certainly, council member. I think in the area of aggressive solicitation versus aggressive confrontation, it didn't change. We either observed it or we didn't under either circumstance. When I was talking before about observable conduct, I was really talking specifically about those health issues, such as urinating or defecating in a public place. If we came across someone who had set up a camp on any downtown street or elsewhere, and there were fecal matter or there were needles in public space, if we didn't observe that, then we couldn't necessarily hold that person accountable for it. So when I was talking about observable conduct, it was in light of that set of circumstances. With various laws on the books, there are requirements that officers either observe the conduct or there is evidence that exists that the conduct occurred. So none of that changes with what's going on in the ordinances. I was just giving an example of what might happen if we showed upon a scene that we were called to and we couldn't prove the conduct was committed by the individual that we're interacting with.
But how does that interact, though, with the existing ordinance and changing that? Would that change that would change how you could approach things, would it not?
I think the change that could happen is under current language and ordinances, the mere act of sitting and lying is the violation. The mere act of camping is the violation. Under the new ordinances, you've got this higher threshold of it has to be hazardous or dangerous. So the possibility could exist that we could get a call from a citizen that is complaining upon someone who is sitting and lying or is camping, and they could give us a set of circumstances that they believe made it dangerous or hazardous. And by the time the officer arrives, if that conduct is not occurring anymore or we can't tell that it occurred, we might not be able to enforce it because we couldn't go in and establish in a court that had occurred. So that would be the circumstance, I think, where that might come into play in light of the ordinances that are being discussed.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate the clarification.
And Mayor, to your point, I appreciate that, yes, on the aggressive solicitation, nothing is changing. As far as preventing aggression, the tools we have to prevent aggression would exist in both cases. Then some folks might ask, what is the reason that we're changing anything at all? And you didn't draw that out. And so I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the difference here would be currently if somebody asks for money and it's 7:30 at night downtown, they are committing a criminal act. What this would change is if it's 7:30 at night downtown and somebody asks for money and they do so peacefully, that would no longer be a criminal violation of the law. But however, if that person at 7:30 at night is threatening or obscene to the level that you stop any other threatening or obscene behavior, that does not change. So things that rise to the level of threatening or obscene or dangerous, that's where there is no change, as the mayor described. But to the point where somebody is not violating any other rules, asking for money at 7:30 at night would no longer be a criminal violation. So that is, for example, an example of what does change. Is that
That's
right?
how I read it as well.
Okay. Chief, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Colleagues, we have some people we invited here to speak. It is 12:10. I had wanted them to come and speak mainly to the issue of what it is the issue, not to speak to us on what the solutions are, the right answers are. That's the conversation we have over the next 2 weeks and into next week, but to really focus on what it is that the issue and to get, if we can, agreement from everybody involved that with respect to this change in the ordinance, as opposed to what do we do about buckets 1 and number 2, what's operating here is, as the police says, are you taking away, because we are taking away a tool in 3, and do we want to take away that tool in 3? Because that's what Councilmember Cassar's resolution, I think it takes away the ability to arrest when there is not a violation of 1 or 2. It doesn't change what determines a violation of 1 or 2. We can certainly have that conversation. We can make it easier or harder. But whatever it is that determines 1 or 2, we're not taking away a tool to deal with that. What we are taking away is the ability to arrest somebody who is not doing something in the first or second bucket. And I want the community to focus then on that issue, since that's the issue remaining. I don't know if you want to take a break and we go to citizen communication now. There are, I think, 5 speakers, 4 speakers. We could have them do that. And then if we could quickly go through the panels with that limited discussion, maybe that would be a good place for us to break. You want to do that? Okay, so I'm going to call the 4 citizen communication speakers. We're going to continue then pulling up the people panel, and then we'll break for executive session.
That's fine, Mayor. My one, I think, clarifying change for everybody watching on bucket 1 or 2 is health, safety, impeding the ability to use public space, and not breaking any of our existing rules.
Right.
For example, breaking our existing rules according for parks. So some folks have raised the question, could people who do not want to wait outside of ACL now stay overnight in the park? The answer is there are rules that say you can't stay overnight in parks. There's rules that say you can't camp in parks. So it's actually somebody who's not a health or safety violation, not blocking unreasonably the use of public space, and not breaking any other rules that we have that we establish.
Right. That's what we're talking about. And next 2 weeks is what is our community response when someone is not breaking any of our rules other than sitting in line or camping.
And I understand that, but we also have to talk about what our rules really are.
I agree with that. But that isn't just not being put in issue. That question exists whether we change this or not. The
Right.
question.
That's right.
So right. So we're talking about what this proposed change is. That is certainly something we should talk about. So again, colleagues, appreciate the indulgence here. I want to bring up, if we could, some folks here to speak to us relatively quickly before we go into executive session. First, some of the providers, service providers in the community. I think we might have some folks from ECHO. I think Mark Littlefield and Ann Howard may be here, and I think Heidi Sloan might be here with Movilos and Fishes, and someone here from Austin Interfaith, John Elford, might be with us. If you all would come forward. The next panel that we're going to have is going to be some of the downtown people, so DAA, if they're here, and in that second group, and maybe APA if they're present. And then some of the civil justice folks will be in the third group. I appreciate you all coming down. In a second, I want you just to go down and introduce yourself and say who you are. It's next week that we're going to have the debate and the discussion on what we should be doing with respect to these things. And we're going to be getting information and data, of course, over the course of the, what? In 2 weeks. I said it again. I'm just over-eager, you know. So I'm not really interested, and I think now's not the time for us to discuss what the solutions are. But I want the community to really understand what it is that we're actually talking about. We have a proposed change, and the proposed change from Councilmember Kassar, he says, is intended to just focus on the situation where there is no public health violation and there is no safety violation, however that's determined, that there is not one of those two. But we still have some people in the community that are calling up and saying, do something about what I'm seeing. It's not a public safety violation. No one's threatening anybody. It's not a public health situation. What do we do? And I want to understand if we have successfully narrowed the issues to that one thing that we're able to be talking about here. So why don't you introduce yourself and then talk about this question of what's at issue with this resolution that we're going to be considering in 2 weeks.
Try that again. Good afternoon. My name is Mark Littlefield. I'm the board chair of ECHO.
My name is Ann Howard. I'm the executive director at ECHO.
And I'm Heidi Sloan, and I'm here with Mobilos and Fishes.
Thank you all for being here. You want to talk about kind of what it is that the council is needing to deal with here?
Sure, I'll start. I have a real brief statement from ECHO. At ECHO, our mission is to provide dynamic, proactive leadership that engages policymakers and the community to end homelessness in any bucket you choose. All buckets. We're trying to end homelessness in all those buckets. The way to end homelessness is with more housing and fewer barriers to that housing. In recent years, ECHO has collaborated with excellent and compassionate partners such as the Downtown APD Command and the Downtown Austin Alliance to address the panhandling ordinance, the camping ordinance, and the sit-lie ordinance. But there are still issues to resolve in order to keep our streets safe and to decriminalize homelessness. A November 2017 City of Austin Auditor's Report concluded that certain city ordinances may create barriers for people as they attempt to exit homelessness. Citing people for violating these ordinances also does not appear to be an effective means of connecting that individual to the services they need, nor is it an efficient use of city resources. In the last 3 years alone, the City of Austin has handed out thousands of tickets downtown for things like panhandling, sitting on sidewalks, and setting up camps. The vast majority of these $160 tickets go unpaid. Eventually, warrants are issued, and arrests are made, which create additional barriers to housing. ECHO supports the policies expressed in item 45 on the June 6, 2019 Austin City Council agenda to amend and remove ordinances which criminalize the status of homelessness and create systemic barriers to housing. We are confident that as a community, we can find better ways to address problematic behaviors without creating additional barriers to housing. Thank you.
I wanted to address how the criminal activity or the warrants that end up coming out of these tickets impact homelessness. Due to Austin's very low vacancy rate in the rental market, many properties are able to vigorously screen prospective tenants. So because there's no shortage of eager renters. Properties review applicants' criminal history, credit history, or rental history, and income when assessing for tenancy. At many properties, any arrests or convictions, felonies or misdemeanors, will result in a denial for housing, regardless of the nature of the offense, the time since conviction, or any other extenuating circumstances. Almost every property will deny an applicant for an outstanding criminal charge or having an active warrant. It's just the way it is. Properties that will consider applicants with criminal histories tend to be located in lower opportunity neighborhoods already burdened by heavy drug trade. Some of those properties may charge a higher monthly rent or deposit in exchange for accepting an applicant with a criminal history. Over the last few years, that's the work ECHO has been doing, is to partner with properties to reduce that screening criteria. And sometimes we pay to do that. Of course, individuals with more serious charges have almost no housing options and wait for months or even years before we can negotiate a safe place for them to live. So I'm grateful to work for a group like ECHO, the ECHO Board of Directors, that supports this. And I'm very grateful for your leadership, because I believe you're trying to get to the place to do the right thing. But I think we also need to be smart, not just right. And to be smart, we need to shrink that third bucket. We need to figure out how we have fewer people on the street. And thankfully, you've endorsed an action plan that addresses that. It talks about outreach and shelter and housing and services and addressing racial disparities that just plague this whole set of dynamics. And so to me, again, as we address that bucket, that third bucket, we're talking about where's the money to reduce homelessness? Where's the money to help get these folks off the street into housing-focused shelter? How do we create the flow so that we can say, you're not going to be here on the street. You don't have to suffer on the street like this. Those demons racing in your head, we have doctors to help you. We can afford the medication to help you. And right now, we're not doing that. And so I think that's part of the conversation, Mayor, that we've got to get to as we address that third bucket, to make that third bucket a little pale, because everybody else has gotten off the street. I think we can do that, and we'll be the first community in the country to figure this out.
So just so I understand quickly, we have a debate discussion about what we do in the third bucket, and that's the conversation we're having. But ECHO and you guys are not advocating that we do anything to decriminalize public safety offenses. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
You're not trying to decriminalize the aggressive behavior, the threatening behavior, the touching. You're not recommending we decriminalize anything that's in bucket 1 or 2. You're saying with respect to bucket 3, let's decrease the number of people or end the number of people, whichever, that are being criminalized where there's not a public safety violation, however it's determined, or a public health determination, however it's determined. Isn't that correct?
We clearly support decriminalization of homelessness, and we want everybody on the streets to be safe, whether it's my mom or your mom or the homeless mom.
Right, but you're not talking about decriminalizing public safety violations and decriminalizing public health violations. And that, I think, is what we're trying to do.
I want to say one more thing. You know, we also support our police officers in being able to know what the law is and what the expectation of this community is, because I think we'll all be safer. I think the homeless population will be safer when we enforce the law.
Got it. Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting us. I'm super proud to be sitting on this panel. I'm also super proud to be here representing Mobilos and Fishes. We have been a part of the Homes Not Handcuffs Coalition for several months now, and that has been great work. We come to that coalition and to the work of decarceration because we are in the business of palliative relief. We have been for the last 21 years now driving food trucks out to the city of Austin and stopping on street corners and handing out sandwiches and listening to people's stories and developing a sense of care in our community for persons still experiencing homelessness. And so I relish the opportunity to talk about housing, and I would love to tell more about Community First and the feeling of bringing someone home. But I think it's really important to recognize that people experiencing homelessness exist in a continuum that is not just the continuum of care. It's not just the points that we see them. It's not just the points that they're interacting with the police. It's not just the points where they are applying for housing. They exist in the world and have needs in the world 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And if we're not willing to step back and look at the existence and the experience of people experiencing homelessness on the streets right now and the impact of these ordinances on their lives right now where they are, then we're not doing real justice to this work. And so I just want to point out that Mobilos and Fishes and other service providers around the city, as was pointed out in the audit a few years ago, we see the ordinances not just as an ineffective tool for building this bridge for community agreement around what this third bucket should look like, but actually a barrier to us providing services to the people that we care about the most. And we've talked some about that today in the form of warrants and jail time and housing application time. But I will tell you that there is something much more basic here, that when I talk to people who are still living out on the streets, who have maybe applied for housing, for us, we take in folks who have experienced chronic homelessness. So most of them have been on the streets for at least a year, many, many more of them for 10s or 20s of years. And for most people, their average wait time to get into housing, permanent supportive housing, is about 2 years. So this is a long time that we're trying to interact with people and keep them on board, even moving towards that continuum of care regarding housing. This isn't even talking about folks who haven't applied yet. And in the meantime, in those 2 years, they're balancing this idea of trying to live and survive and to eat and to have money and to sleep and to rest and to not be ill and to manage their mental health, which I will tell you, I don't know how people could possibly exit 2 years of living on the streets of Austin, Texas without shelter, without having some sort of deep mental health need. And people are trying to work with that and trying to do their best to manage that even without shelter available to them. And it's not just about shelter either. What it's about is the fact that if you are arrested, then your belongings may not be there when you come back to them. If your camp is swept away and your tent is thrown in the trash, then your prescriptions probably get thrown in the trash with your tent. If you are fleeing the presence of police because you do not want to be in violation of these ordinances as they exist right now, you are moving further and further away from services, and the services that are able to reach you are less and less consistent. For me, what that looks like is when I go to find someone that I've developed a relationship with, who has applied for housing, who is hoping to come home, who has done everything to be able to get on that wait list and to keep up their spot there. If they have been recently ticketed, if they have a warrant, if they have been recently arrested, it all pretty much looks the same to me. It looks like they're gone. It might be that they are in the hospital. It might be that they are in Del Valley. But what it looks like to me is that they're gone, and I can no longer check in with them. I can no longer check on their mental state. I can no longer check to make sure that they have food. I can no longer bring them in for an appointment to talk about housing with them. And so these ordinances at their base, because they target people who are experiencing homelessness, are a tool that actually mostly promotes fear. And fear pushes people away from downtown Austin, but away from the services that we have in place for them. And so I want to talk about decriminalization, but I also want to talk about a sort of repeal that moves entirely away from talking about behaviors associated with homelessness altogether, to remove that fear, to remove that stigma as much as we possibly can.
Thank you very much. And again, for the work that you all do, greatly appreciated. But to be clear, you're not suggesting that we decriminalize someone who is creating a public safety violation, are you?
No, I'm talking about decriminalizing behaviors associated with homelessness.
And you're, again, not talking about decriminalizing someone who is threatening the public health of the community?
No.
Okay. And I think that's really important. Again, this debate discussion we're having is about the third bucket. Does anybody have any question for these providers before we get to the next panel? Thank you very much for being with us.
Mayor, one last thing I just want to throw in there is that for folks who are here today, folks who are watching at home, who are watching this issue or recent frequent City Hall observers, a lot of times there's an issue where it's one side or the other. I'm for this, I'm against you. There are some folks who are going to come speak next from either the APD Downtown Command, the Downtown Austin Alliance. These are our true partners who we work together. This really is not an adversarial thing, I don't believe, and I'm very proud of the help and the relationships that we have with some of those folks.
Thank you.
Real quick before, I'm sorry, can I ask a question before they?
Yes.
You touched on something that I asked the chief, and I just want to make sure I understand that, in fact, if you have an active warrant, it can affect your ability to find housing or to get a job.
Absolutely.
People that check verified jobs, if they're looking up your job history, or if they're considering hiring you or considering bringing you in as a tenant, they can search some database that shows you have an active warrant and say, sorry, you have an active warrant.
And it even happens, Councilmember, before that. Went back at the office, we search for that because we are trying to most quickly get this client into a residence. And so we look up their history. We look up, do they have an active warrant? Because then we know what our options are, and they're very few.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a representative from Downtown Association. I wanted to give the APA an opportunity to be part of this. I don't know if they were able to make it here or not. Doesn't look like it. Why don't you? That's okay.
Panel of
Before
one, do you mind if I stand?
Don't mind at all. So in a second, I want you to introduce yourself. I want to begin by thanking you and the Downtown Alliance for working with me in my office. I guess my colleagues on the dais as well, although I wasn't part of those conversations, trying to figure out the best way to deal with this. And I think that there were some concerns that were raised in the community about making sure that whatever we did here, if we did something, did not decriminalize criminal conduct, didn't decriminalize a public safety violation, didn't decriminalize a public health violation. Certainly we have this third area to talk about where there's not an allegation that a police officer feels that they could move forward with either on public safety or on public health, but still is presenting an additional challenge to the community. What do we do on that? And that's what we're going to be trying to figure out. But I want to make sure that from your perspective, we have successfully protected the first and second buckets, that we haven't accidentally decriminalized something that should be criminalized, so that, because if there are those kind of things, I want to make sure we take care of them so that we focus really the attention on the third. And then you had written a memo, Steve, about a year ago with some suggestions on how to deal with the solicitation ordinance, because you had identified some challenges with that. We've tried to follow some of the suggestions that you had in fact had made or address some of the concerns that you had written. So if you want to touch base on that briefly too, that'd be helpful. So please introduce yourself and then you have the mic.
I'm Steve Roberts. I have not had the pleasure to meet all of you. I am the chair of the Safety and Hospitality Committee of the Downtown Austin Alliance and have been for about 5 years. I'm a lawyer by trade. I have practiced law in downtown Austin for over 30 years. I have not lived down in Austin, but my best friend lived a block from Salvation Army years ago when it was Needle Park. Very familiar with downtown. And I volunteered a few years ago because I thought it was time to give back. I want to first say that we have a lot of common ground. I appreciate the comments from Echo that this is not adversarial. Let me talk about the common ground first. Well, I'll back up a minute. You mentioned my memo. Last year, there was a movement to take a amended ordinance and put it before City Council. We read it. The community had problems with it. The city manager arranged for a downtown forum, and what we heard was fear. If you eliminate completely all aggressive solicitation, we heard fear. We heard fear from people on the streets, from residents, from businesses. So that's what we dealt with. That gave me the opportunity. I'm not a constitutional lawyer. There's only about 20 cases, though, to understand the limits of the constitutionality. And we have to educate our community that whether or not you like somebody coming up and asking you for money, they have the constitutional right to do that. So we don't even need to have that conversation. Let's get that very, very clear. That's part of our role, is to educate the community. But let me be very clear. No one should be punished for suffering from homelessness. We agree. The current statutes, particularly the solicitation statute, is unconstitutional. The others are also unconstitutional. They're also wrong. And the only reason why they've stayed on the books, in my opinion, is because the law enforcement policy changed to come closer to within the bounds of the Constitution. Well, that's not a good situation to put it on the police to take a statute and only enforce it up to their level of constitutionality. That is the problem we face. Our issues, and I will address them, again, are not adversarial. Maybe they're a little lawyerly, but our issues are with specific proposals proposed less than 2 weeks ago. So I want to address that. But before I do, I'd like to give you a little context about what we see downtown, because this conversation makes no sense without context. In the last point of time count in January, there were over 700 people sleeping within 1/4 mile of our service centers downtown. 700 people. I don't care whether they're behaving or not. You have a public health and a humanitarian crisis right here, right now. If you walk under the bridge on 7th Street on Waller Creek, as I have, you have a human waste pouring into our streams. We have a public safety problem now, regardless of this. This is our concern. This is what we hear. We had a crane operator send us pictures of human waste in the alleys. It's that bad. So what do we do about that? And I want to address that very first. The sheer number is the problem. What we believe is that for a decade we've been trying housing first and not building shelter until we had the path to housing. Unintentionally, what we've done is left people on the streets because there's never been enough money for housing. And ECHO has a great vision. Last year they said, here's a vision for permanent supportive housing. But we need to go from $30 million a year to $70 million a year. So why you try and find that money in this political climate? What we're saying is shelter now. When San Diego had a hepatitis epidemic, they built shelters now. They didn't plan, pilot, take a year and add 100 beds. So that's where we're coming from, shelter now. And I will tell you, if the city can do that, we, the private community, we have talked to a lot of people with a lot of money. You create a plan. You deal with this problem, and we will bring the money for the next step. The path out of shelter is housing, self-resolution, but there's another layer that we have identified, and some members of council have traveled with us to Houston and to Denver. We're looking for creative ideas. And one is this, that we can all get behind. First, shelter. Everyone deserves shelter. Roof over their head, safety, cleanliness. But the next step is not everybody is ready for a 6-month lease apartment. Up until after the Depression, we had an entire line of housing for people, which you could loosely call boarding homes. In and out, easy in and out. Safety and also privacy. Think of it as converted motels. So we want to also throw out this idea that there is a step that the private sector can get behind, that one place to move people from shelter that can be done quicker and faster while you're waiting for affordable housing
Mayor,
is conversions.
I'm sorry, let me ask a quick question. Just because handing an attorney a mic, all due respect, with no parameters on the subject or time, and we were supposed to be doing this really quick. And so if we're going to, I want to stand up and say relevance because we're talking specifically about 3 ordinances. So thank you for that context, but I think we need to talk about the changes that we were.
I've finished the context.
There will be an opportunity to talk about the larger issues.
Right.
But
The reason why I brought the context up is for the future discussion of the third basket. What do we do until then?
okay, so hold that thought because we'll get back.
I am holding it.
Okay.
Thank you. So I do want to talk about what our problems is and focus on the public safety, on specific issues before us to throw this out for your discussion. On the issue of aggressive confrontation, one thing that Councilmember Kazar has asked City Council, has asked the police, don't we have state laws in place right now that would prohibit the same behavior as the proposed statute? I would suggest to you that you read the statutes because 40 years ago I was a police officer and I had to read the statute. And to your question, how do we know whether you violated the law? Well, first it's the policeman's judgment. And then it's the prosecutor's judgment. And then it's the judge's judgment. All we can do is make it as clear as we can and go down that chain. So I'll give you an example. Assault works, clearly. You can't assault somebody. But what about disorderly conduct? In the state statute, it bans abusive, indecent, profane, vulgar language in a public place, but only if it tends to incite an immediate breach of the peace. Similarly, offensive gestures are only illegal if they tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace. You can read it. There's nowhere else in the disorderly conduct statute that really applies. We think it's important for both the police and the public to have clarity. I had not read, Mayor, your suggested changes, but I can tell you in principle, we really think you're getting to the concerns of the downtown community by being content neutral and focusing on conduct. To the comments about whether it's vague or not, what gives me comfort as a lawyer and as a former law enforcement person is if you read this carefully, there is no aggressive confrontation unless it's intended to or is likely to cause a reasonable person to fear imminent bodily harm or theft. That's the bottom line. You can be as offensive as you want as long as you don't cause that reasonable fear. That gives us the boundaries of the constitutional speech that we need. So that was my comment on the solicitation. So one, I don't think it's duplicative. I think it gives us a specificity of behavior we do need to protect everyone against, including the people living on the streets, by the way. On the issue of camping, on the public safety piece is what you've asked me to address. We've been criticized for, and the community's been criticized for saying, oh, now can people camp in parks? And you say, of course not. There's a curfew, for example. This may be a minor point, but I suggest we could add clarity because if I were a defense attorney, I would read the proposed statute to say, one, you commit an offense if you camp anywhere but a designated area, but you only commit an offense if you're a public threat. How does that square with a curfew when camping generally isn't controlled by curfew? So if that's not the intent, I would just suggest clarity.
Remember, Alter raised a similar issue with respect to that, and our attorneys are taking a look at it.
And
So
I
thank you for that.
think that's just a language issue because I've heard that's not the intent. As to public safety, the culpable mental state. I heard the chief say, well, that could be problematic. Here's a thought. In the state statute that you've modeled this changed language at, there's also a person violates the rule if they've been warned, if they've been asked, been given a reasonable command. Whether you know it or not, you're blocking a driveway. And then they don't respond, that could be a violation. So I think we could have both the culpable mental state and we can have a fair warning. The same thing, camping is the sit and lying. And I think with those changes, we're addressing the public safety issues. So the only thing I would like to conclude with in the third basket is just throw out this as a rhetorical thought, rhetorical question. The sidewalks on Congress are 18 feet wide. There's plenty of place to put a tent, one tent. Is that okay? Is it okay if people lie down at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and sleep? They're not blocking. They're not in a doorway. Is that okay? What if it's 10 people? What if it's 20 people? What if it's 2nd Street? I would suggest to you that I've reviewed statutes in very liberal cities from Portland, Venice, California, LA, and every city has some restriction in their downtown area on where you can sit, lie, and camp. Because it becomes unconstitutional when there's nowhere to sit, lie, and camp. But there's no reason why a matter of public policy you can't restrict the area. And I have heard people talk about or dismiss non-safety related regulations as aesthetics, about people being offended by the homeless. But I want to conclude by reading to you from the City Council resolution on the sit and lie ordinance on what the council found was a compelling public need. And I would suggest to you this compelling public need is still here. The council finds that the city has a compelling interest in encouraging and preserving a vital pedestrian-friendly urban core, promoting tourism and business in the central business district, preserving the quality of urban life and in protecting its citizens from intimidating behavior, and encouraging businesses and neighborhoods in the central city where walking is a realistic alternative to vehicles that use fossil fuels. The council finds that in areas with high pedestrian traffic and a high incidence of petty crime related to the public disorder, individuals sitting or lying in the pedestrian right-of-way contribute to a sense of fear, intimidation, and disorder, are disruptive to residents, businesses, and customers, discourage, block, or inhibit the free passage of pedestrians, and contribute to the loss of access to and enjoyment of public places. We are relying on a tax base, an increased tax base to help the homeless. That requires a vibrant downtown. That is a bigger basket 3 issue. I don't have the language for you. I don't have the specific suggestion, but that is an issue that we think needs to be discussed thoroughly.
Thank you, and I appreciate the comments, and I appreciate the edit. Stay there for just 1 second. And I appreciate the help because we're trying to get this into a place where we clearly are taking care, I think, for me, taking care of buckets 1 and 2. You know, sometimes I think that one of your functions has been to raise some of the concerns that are being heard in the community, and enabling that to happen, then we can address them. The APA isn't here today. I would be asking them the same kinds of questions because I think that they have also raised some of the concerns that we hear in the community. And again, we want to make sure that we address them. There was an op-ed piece, I think, that was submitted here this week, and it expressed a concern that I have also heard in other places in the community, that we would be doing something by our action to decriminalize and now to allow people to scream at or touch or block passage, to follow you when you didn't want to be followed. That was before we had proposed keeping the aggressive behavior ordinance, just taking out solicitation. But I hope that, I know you haven't had a chance to read it yet, that you'll take a look at it and see if we have been able now to maintain what was the pre-existing law with respect to each one of those elements. We just have uncoupled it to a solicitation.
You read the concern, which I didn't write, but the concern was that the other laws are not adequate or specific we need something specific and clear. That was that particular concern.
And I hope by that we've been able to hit that. You had reflected, or the writers of the op-ed had reflected a concern in the community that we would be weakening our ability to regulate behavior that impeded public health or impeded safety by putting in the state standards in that, again, it's our intent not to impede the officer's ability to impede a public safety violation or a public health violation. Please make sure we're accomplishing that in this, because that's not the intent to impede that. As differentiated from the third bucket, where there's not an allegation of public safety or public health, but it goes to the larger issue you were raising in the third bucket, which is, do we want to concern ourselves with the impact on economic development? Do we want to concern it on quality of life? How do we want to deal with the other elements that some in our community are raising other than a violation of public safety and public health?
Yes, I would only add, going back to the public safety, we have another concern. If you don't approach basket 3, we fear that we're going to start seeing the social media we do not want to see in this town, that we're seeing in Portland, we're seeing in Seattle. They're blaming people for being homeless, saying they're turning their cities into cesspools. Where is this anger coming from? It's the spread of encampments, the spread of people living.
Right. But to be
in
fair, we're
line.
talking
so on a
about
public safety issue.
Right.
We're concerned about you're going to be harming the people on the streets by getting public pushback from elements of our society we do not want to hear. In this community.
And I understand
Mayor.
it, but that goes then to the third bucket. Yes, Mr. Flanagan?
To be fair, Mr. Bryce, that fear is coming from your organization.
It is.
Let me finish.
Okay.
The editorial you and the Crime Commission and the Chamber put together is full of exactly the type of stuff we've shown today is not true. And I've had that conversation with the leader of your organization to make that very point 2 days before the editorial went out. So let's be very clear about where misinformation is coming from. And I do take offense to you saying things to this council and wagging your finger in our face saying that we haven't read the law. I guarantee you, we have read the law, and there are some serious issues we're going to work out. That's why it's being postponed for 2 weeks. And I really hope that we can continue this in a very respectful manner.
Okay, I hear the comments. Taking a forward-looking view on this, the intent here, and taking the op-ed that was written as a statement of concerns, my understanding is that the way we have added language with respect to the no sit, no lie, no camp, the keeping of the aggressive behavior issues, we have preserved all of the tools that our police have when they are dealing with a public safety issue and a public health issue.
Yes,
And
I
the
think
debate in our community now is on the third bucket. What do we do when those things are not presented? And I would appreciate your organization and the APA and everybody in this community, not just those two, but everybody. My office's communication as well, to really focus this community on that third bucket, because it's a hard bucket. And what we want to avoid is confusing people thinking that we're talking about decriminalizing behavior that creates a public safety violation, which we're not doing, or decriminalizing behavior that creates a public health violation, which we're not doing. And I think we're all united in that. So I don't want people to think that there's a difference in that. We're all united on that. And if everybody will understand that, then that will open the door for us to be able to have the conversation on the third.
I agree with that. And the one tool the police ask us for, and our ambassadors ask us for, and the host team ask us for, that we're not solving, but I want to close with this. They say, when we ask somebody to move, where can we tell them where to go? When we answer that question, we will be on the road.
Great, thank you.
I want to appreciate everything this council is doing. You're so far ahead of everything we've seen. Thank you.
Thank you. Ann, did you have something, or Kathy, did you have something?
Well,
Kathy?
do you want to go first?
Thank you for the words that you expressed about the private community and their willingness to step up and help provide those longer-term housing solutions, which are so desperately needed. Since some of your conversation talked about the need to build emergency shelter, I would just say while we're talking about this conversation, I know we'll have an opportunity to talk about it again later, I just want the public to really understand the resources we have to construct shelter are more than the resources the city has to run the shelters. And that we just have to really understand as a community, because we will need private support to help with some of those functions. I mean, we've been talking this week, for example, about the Salvation Army, who is in a similar situation. They did a very tremendously successful capital campaign, but don't yet have the funding to operate that shelter at full capacity. Later in the day, we'll talk about another housing-focused shelter that the city would put resources to creating. But again, it's the maintenance and operations, the ongoing resources that would have to come from general fund resources, which are limited in the best of cases, and now with the work that the legislature has done to impose tax caps are going to be even more limited. So, we really need to be very clear as we have these conversations. It's not just those longer-term housing solutions that we're going to need the private community to step up and help with. We have a huge challenge, and I don't know how we're going to meet it in terms of funding. We may have the resources to construct more shelter, but we don't have the resources identified to run those shelters. And so this has to be a community effort. So thank you again for your commitment from the private community to help with those longer-term solutions. We really need the private community to help with those operations costs at the shelters as
And
well.
I should have addressed that. We do believe that we can bring money to the table for that. The one thing that people ask us, we're not quite there yet, but between the city and us and ECHO and the others, we're very close to answering this question. What is the plan? There's been a lot of work done in the city, and we're close to answering that, and when that happens, we think we can bring money to the table.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate the DAA's ongoing commitment to being good partners in ending homelessness. As I listened to the report this morning on KUT about New York City and San Francisco and LA and some of the numbers that they're dealing with in terms of individuals experiencing homelessness, the issue we have in Austin is dire, and every one of those individuals should be housed. We still have a population. I mean, this is a doable for a city like Austin. Housing every one of those individuals is very doable and manageable, especially when compared to other major cities. And so, but again, it's going to be that partnership between the city and the philanthropy and private business. So thank you again for the DAA's willingness to continue to collaborate on those solutions.
And the faith community, I don't want to leave them out. They're an important part.
Ann, did you have any quick comments?
Yes, I would just echo what Councilmember Tovo said, and then I would just add another lens that I look at it through, and that is it's a matter of priorities. We have a lot of resources in this community. We also have a lot of resources within our budget and a lot of resources within the community. So it is an all-hands-on-deck activity for our community. But let's create the environment with all of your help where we're talking about how we bring those resources to the table, because it's a matter of priority. And I want to focus on how we make sure that we identify all those resources, because I don't believe it's a matter of saying that we can't find the dollars. I think it's a matter of saying we made this a priority. So we made homelessness a priority. We recognize it. It's for all the reasons that we continue to talk about it, and we just need to do it. I don't think we need more planning. I don't think we need to think about what needs to happen. I think we need housing. We need everybody to come to the table, and let's make it happen. So
we agree. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, Councilmember Cassar.
Thank you for your testimony, your words, for that memo in the past. And I think that we actually agree on so much. You said that all three you believe are unconstitutional or have unconstitutional components, all need to be changed, all have components that are wrong, and that we need to focus on public safety and health violations or aggressive and threatening behavior, and to differentiate that from peaceful behavior. And I think on that front, I agree entirely with you. I haven't heard anybody on the dais disagree with you, and I don't think any of the advocates disagree with you. I can't think of a single person in this debate that has suggested otherwise. I share some of Councilmember Flanagan's frustrations that it's been suggested that people suggested otherwise. But the fact of the matter is, I think the intention from everybody here has been all of those things. So it sounds like our disagreement seems pretty small, which is about form, which is about should we have a law that makes it doubly or triply clear, potentially beyond what the city attorney and the police chief have said. And if it's form, then that seems like something that can get worked out. So you raised a concern about whether parks rules should be in this ordinance or not. I'm looking right now at a city ordinance that says a violation of park rules is a Class C misdemeanor. And then I pull up the parks rules that are attached, and it says a person may not camp at a park. To me, it seems really clear. And I think if I handed that to you, you might agree with me that it's actually pretty clear. Just like the police chief clarified that if a person isn't asking for money, but is instead accosting someone in a frightening manner, in a threatening manner for their phone number, which I also think is a big problem downtown, that the police can intervene in that situation, especially that person may not be homeless, most likely actually isn't. And the police can intervene in that situation, and I think could intervene in that situation even if we passed exactly what's on the agenda for today. But I recognize your disagreement that maybe you would like that to be more clear. And if in the end all we're working out in the next 2 weeks is that form question, then I think that that's something that we can overcome. I also really appreciate your suggestion actually about notification, because that's just in one part as opposed to in multiple parts. And I think that's a really constructive suggestion and something that maybe we should incorporate. I have concerns about the geographic stuff, but in the end, if that's what it comes down to, it doesn't sound like really that much. So I appreciate your frankness and your tenor, and I think we can sort it out. And on bucket number 3, I'll just remind everyone today, I think on consent we added $8 million more behind this issue just today. I look forward to supporting Councilmember Kitchen's item to have new shelter, as you've described, and some of us just before this council meeting were cutting a ribbon at the Rathgaber Center, which I hope the public puts dollars behind and the private sector puts dollars behind. So as far as addressing issue 3, just today, we cut a ribbon on a shelter. We're thinking about buying another shelter, and we put $8 million in public funds behind it. And I think that that's the kind of action it's going to take, and I appreciate you asking the private sector to try to meet us there. So thank you, sir.
I really agree with what you're saying on buckets 1 and 2. It's a matter of wordsmithing, thinking it through, getting it right. That's the only thing. Bucket 3 is the big issue. What do we do until we have the housing? Do we limit behavior that is not an immediate threat to public safety? And if so, how?
Thank you, sir.
That is our issue. That's our
Thank you.
concern.
Councilmember Alter?
I might have one question
I'm
for
so
you.
sorry.
First, I wanted to just comment to Mr. Kazar, since we're not in the same quorum, that you might want to look at what we just did with respect to the behavioral ordinances in the transportation code with dockless. But that was a section of the code that only applied to right-of-ways and roads. But we added into the ordinance something that said that all park rules apply, just to be extra crystal clear on that. And very similar language, I think, might be usable in this case in that regard. I wanted to just ask if you could elaborate on what more you need to know from us about what needs to be done to have those investments flow from the private sector into helping us address this homeless issue more than has already been done to date.
You've already done so much. When I said we're in the last mile, I'll explain. When you have a permanent person with authority in the city whose one job is to focus on homelessness, that's one. And you're getting that within 30 days, I understand. Number 2, we and other people in the community have created a schematic of homelessness, working with the city, working with your innovation department, building on what Sarah Hensley spent a year doing, studying the problem. I agree with you. We've studied it. You've got your data. So now it's a matter of, with this data, with the city taking the lead, with everyone standing around, what does this look like? And it's not too hard. Shelter and every path out of shelter you can find, and services to go with it, and mental health issues. It's not that complicated anymore, but it needs to be a plan that everybody's on board with. That's what it will take.
Well, I hope that when that person is on board, that we can have some follow-up discussions and take advantage of these offers, because we do need the whole community, the private sector, and the nonprofit to join with us as government in trying to address some of the issues and help people to get into homes. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir. All right. We have some civil justice folks with us. Why don't you come on down? And then we also have some folks that have firsthand experience with homelessness that have offered to be with us. Yes?
Mayor, just as people are coming down, I just want to make sure the record is clear. You all are having a robust conversation about these ordinances, but I do want to say that our ordinances as written are not unconstitutional. There's been no finding of that, so I just want to be clear about that on the record. I know that you are going to make changes and that you all approve of those changes.
Right. And certainly any one member of the council can speak for the city's position on that, or even a majority of the council. So here, again, it's over the next 2 weeks and next week when we will have a conversation about what it is that we need to do. I think the purpose of today is really to focus attention on the difference between buckets 1 and 2 and 3 so that we really focus attention. I'm going to start with the two gentlemen at the outside and give you a chance to speak first. Welcome you to introduce yourself. You've heard the conversation that we've been having, and I want to give you an opportunity to visit with the council, each of you, and then we'll go to the two folks in the middle. Sir.
My name is Stephen James Potter. I am homeless.
I don't think your microphone's on. Press that button again, will you?
Yes.
That works. All right.
My name is Stephen James Potter. I have been homeless for a number of years. I am also a member of Gathering Ground Theater Troupe, the larger Homes Not Handcuffs Coalition, Austin's Homelessness Advisory Council, and a voting member of ECHO's Membership Council. In addition to that, I worked with a number of organizations that serve the homeless. For 2 years, I worked as a Salvation Army monitor for the men's dorm. I say all that to say this: there are very few people that know homelessness more than I do. And what these ordinances do, a day-to-day existence of your average homeless person, generally you feel like a refugee in your own country, in your own city, in your own neighborhood. You feel like a refugee. These ordinances, as present, criminalize me for just sitting or lying, or it has been mentioned. With that, we feel that the language as currently is wrong. The language that we have submitted, we feel, is much more in line with both buckets 1 and 2, and at the same time addresses bucket 3 in a manner that is holistic and actually provides the homeless person a little bit of sanctuary, a little bit of hope. Hope's hard to come to on the street. I would add to another point. The homeless person that has been characterized today has been mentioned as someone who has a mental health issue. That is certainly the case, and there are a number of folks who have mental health issues. There are a number of folks that have substance abuse issues. But more and more, what we're seeing in the homeless community, and I speak to many of my fellow homeless, more and more, it's a simple economic issue. They simply can't afford to pay for rent with what they're getting paid. Now, living wage, that's a different battlefield, that's a different conversation. But more and more, these folks are simply trying to make a living, trying to do what they want to do, and simply cannot do that economically. 98% compliance was mentioned by APD for these individuals who get up and go voluntarily. My question would be, where do they go? Are they simply going to another spot where they're then in violation of that same ordinance? Do they go to the park? What do they do when it rains? There are very few spots downtown where you can actually get out of the rain. Additionally, it has been mentioned that the number of tickets has decreased. A part of that, I submit, is the work that HOST has done. I have taken the chance to speak to a police officer who works with HOST. and someone sitting in front of Maggie Mays, strung out on K2, their approach to that individual is simply this. They identify the person, EMS is called, and they are transported to the hospital. Now, does that solve that homeless person's problem? No. But that doesn't create an additional barrier to that homeless person getting off the street. So the language that we have submitted and your additions, I agree with. And yeah.
Father, thank you very much for being down here today. Sir.
Hello, my name's Steve Hill. I'm homeless right now. I've been homeless on these streets since 2015. I'm one of the 700s that sleep down here. Yeah, I got tickets. I got one about 3 weeks ago for sitting down. 4:30 in the afternoon, I'm waiting for the doors to open, and here come APD. You, sit, you, go. Sitting down ticket. I think one of the problems is that you're missing the post bucket. You guys got a good chance to make a homeless and APD and you guys a good reputation of let's get together, let's talk about it. It's just weird that how you guys make choices for us. And because these ordinances are, I hate getting tickets because it just ruins my day for the whole day. Then I got to go see Mr. Coffee. Mr. Coffee got to tell me what to do. It's just, we got to work on something better. There got to be a better choice of getting tickets because it's not a crime, but it's a behavior thing. Let's work on the behavior and stop giving us tickets. I'm working on my 12th ticket right now. My last one was sitting down. When was these tickets going to stop? I ain't bugging no one. You guys are taking away shade trees. You guys don't have enough water fountains out there. It's summertime's coming along. One of the spots to sit down is at Pool Choices because it's nice and shady. But if you guys tell us to move, where are we going to move? And it's going to get worse when you guys close the arch and close the day center for the arch, and we can't go in there and sit down when it's hot outside. So what you guys going to do? These ordinances ain't working. You guys have to figure something else out. You got a good opportunity to have the police come down, have you guys come down and talk to us and work with us instead of you guys making choices for us right now. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful. Last two speakers we have on this. You want to help the community understand what's in front of them from your perspective?
Thank you, Mayor and Council members. My name is Emily Garrick. I'm a senior staff attorney at the Texas Fair Defense Project, and we work on criminal justice reform. And one of the things that we've been doing over the last few years is representing low-income people who get tickets in the Austin Municipal Court and in the downtown Austin Community Court. And so we've seen and had a lot of clients who have experienced the devastating effects of these ordinances firsthand. I want to talk about three things. One, that these ordinances are, first, that they're unconstitutional, which I think everyone has recognized today. Two, that they're really counterproductive and actually put up barriers to escaping homelessness. And three, that they're very inhumane and they just go against all of the city's values. So to the first point, I think that everyone here has recognized already that they're unconstitutional. So the no sit, no lie ordinance and the no camping ordinance violate the 8th Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. You're criminalizing people just for existing. They don't have anywhere else to go, and they have no choice but to sleep or live outdoors. And there have been other similar ordinances that have been overturned by the courts in other cities. And then the solicitation ordinance is overly broad and is a violation of First Amendment rights, as has also been discussed. And I think the city has known, at least since November 2017, that there are constitutional problems, and until now, nothing has been done. I also want to just really emphasize how counterproductive these ordinances are. So some people, we've talked about the warrants already. 90% of these tickets do result in warrants. And what that means is that people have barriers to housing, as the Mayor Pro Tem pointed out, and to employment. I have had clients who have gotten to the point where they were offered a job and then they do the search and they see that they have active warrants and they've lost that job opportunity. So it's really devastating. And not only is it a barrier to getting housing and employment, people with warrants can't even go to get their ID. Because if they go to DPS, then there's a chance that they would get a search for warrants there and get arrested when they go to the DPS office to get their ID. And it's really difficult to do anything if you don't have an ID in Texas. And then I also think that there's been a lot of discussion about wanting police to do outreach to homeless individuals and help them. But right now, these ordinances are creating a real sense of fear, and homeless individuals are really scared of the police, and they're not calling the police when they are in danger. And there's been some discussion about other people feeling scared of homeless people, but it's much more likely for homeless people to be victimized than anybody else, and they're in the most need of protection. And right now, they're afraid to call the police because if they go to the police, they could be arrested or ticketed just for existing. And so if we want police to be able to do outreach, then we really need to repeal and amend these ordinances so that they're not targeting homeless people. And then finally, I think it's really obvious that these ordinances are just really inhumane. They go against our values of equity and inclusion. They discriminate against people based on their housing status and say your very existence is illegal. And I think it's important to note that African Americans in Austin are 9 times as likely to experience homelessness as non-Hispanic white Austinites. And so there's a lot of disparate racial impact to these ordinances. I think that what item 45 does right now is that it focuses on the danger, whether or not somebody's putting themselves or others in danger, and on access to public spaces instead of just focusing on whether or not somebody is homeless. I think that for police to be asking themselves questions like, oh, is this person who is sleeping in a median, to go to Councilmember Kitchen's point, if they roll out into traffic, is that dangerous for them? That's the kind of questions that we want police to be asking, not questions like, oh, has this person been sitting too long? Can I give them a ticket? And focusing on public safety, I think that this item 45 is actually putting more of a focus on public safety and making it so that we'll put our resources towards things that the community actually does care about, instead of what's happening right now where we have some of our clients who are getting tickets for doing things like sleeping in their own vehicles, and actually being so scared of getting tickets they're going out into the woods and finding more and more dangerous areas to hide from the police so that they don't get these citations and warrants. We have one member of our coalition that couldn't be here today who actually was so scared of getting warrants that he started going out into the woods and into dangerous areas. He would still have police who would go and find him and say, okay, you need to hide better, and would actually go and sleep in creek beds, and almost died on 2 occasions because of rain, because he was hiding out in the creek bed and sleeping there. And so right now we have the ordinances that are actually making things much more dangerous for people. And I think what Councilmember Kazar has proposed is really focusing in on the issues that we care about, which are public safety and access to public spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor and council members, for the opportunity to speak. My name is Chris Harris. I'm a criminal justice organizer, advocate, and data analyst, and formerly with Grassroots Leadership, now with Just Liberty. I think it's been really well established, both the illegality and the illogical nature of these ordinances. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the inhumanity piece that Emily Garrick talked about. I think we're talking about unavoidable behaviors by people based on their status within our community. That being illegal makes their very existence within our community illegal. Steve, the attorney for DAA, brought up the rhetorical. The police interact with an individual. They are giving them a ticket. They tell them that they can't be here. And the question is, where can they go? And right now, the answer is nowhere. The answer is, as Emily referenced, one of the members of our coalition was told by an officer, is to hide better. That cannot be the solution. And I've heard it mentioned often during the terms of this debate, and over the last year and a half that we've been pushing for the decriminalization of homelessness in our community, is that, well, let's get the housing side figured out first. Let's end homelessness before we tackle these ordinances. And I submit that we can't. We can't wait to provide a place for every single person to be. We have to have an answer to that question, even if that answer is somewhere else in public property that, again, is not threatening the health or safety of anyone, is not obstructing the use of public property for anyone else. It is not threatening public safety in any way. We have to have an answer to that question. And I think that's what these changes are ultimately designed to help do, is to allow there to be a place for folks to be. I think, when we talk about that third bucket that you've really focused on, this is the question: who ultimately has a right to our public space? Do people with homes, with money, the people that are creating economic activity, do they have more of a right to the public space than anyone else? And I'll say that I don't believe so. I think if we really believe in equity and justice in our community, that each and every person in our community, whether or not they have a home or not, whether or not they have money or not, whether they're involved in economic activity or not, does not mean that they have more of a right to public space. Does not mean they have more of a right to feel fear and to utilize our other public services in order to deal with that. I think it's also really important to note the historical origins of laws like this. These come from vagrancy laws. If we're talking about the United States, those are largely introduced immediately following Reconstruction. These are the black codes adopted pretty uniformly in the South and ultimately across this land as a means to control the labor and the access to public space of recently freed slaves. It was to say that we need to actually limit black people, recently freed black people's access to public space, and we need to feed them back into the only avenue available to us for slavery, which is the prison system, which was the convict leasing system at the time. If we look even further back, it's been about really controlling access to public space, and because of the racial disparities in our community of homelessness, enforcement of these ordinances does not look that different. It's about controlling the access of poor and largely black folks' access to public space. And it's about limiting it. And we cannot have that. That cannot be law in the books in our city. That cannot be what our city has as laws that our police are out and enforcing. And so, again, I really want to thank all of you for attempting to address what I consider to be really unjust as well as unconstitutional ordinances that, again, criminalize the very existence of people in our community, say that they have no right to public space within our community, even when they're not causing public health or public safety issues to anyone else. And that it's really, really important that the council act on this. And again, thank you so much for your leadership on it, and really hope and expect everyone to vote the right way on June 20th. Thanks again.
Ms. Garrick, Mr. Harris, thank you very much. Okay? Thank you all very much. Thank you all for participating. I'm sorry, what? Oh, I'm sorry, Councilmember Alter?
Thank you. So, Chris, when we were working on issues with the police oversight, one of the things that we did a lot of was looking at what other cities are doing, and there's a lot of comments that are swirling about other cities. Do you have any information that helps us to understand how much of those situations are due to changes in these ordinances or just simply not having the housing? I don't have any of those facts on that, and I'm sure you guys have already done the research. I was just wondering if you could speak to a little bit about where these ordinances have been changed in other cities and the consequences from your research, what you've learned about that.
I guess I'm not quite clear on what you mean by these situations. You mean just in general, kind of the changes as it relates to these laws?
I've just been hearing comments, and I don't have a basis to assess them, that other cities like Portland and San Diego and Los Angeles are experiencing challenges, and they're conflating those with these ordinances or relaxing these ordinances in those places, and I don't have a way to assess the accuracy of that. And I was wondering if you had any research on that or knowledge about that you might share that would shed light on that.
Well, I would be happy to have further discussions that kind of get into the nitty-gritty on some of the particulars in each individual city, because I do think there are some very specific dynamics at play. I think that what's been crafted as it relates to the ordinances that are in item 45 and address the primary concerns that you've seen come from other cities as it relates to, whether it be what's called Skid Row in Los Angeles or things like that. These ordinances would still prohibit folks from blocking passage or making use of public space unreasonably inconvenient to others, as well as address the public safety issues and public health issues that arise. I think it's been made clear by law enforcement as well as by city legal thus far that the primary scenarios in which they might want to intervene in a situation that does impact public health or public safety, that they still feel that they have the tools to do that. And so it does not appear to me in any way, based on what we have seen in other cities, that the changes that have been proposed would in any way lead to situations like those in some of the cities that people, I think, are unreasonably fear-mongering about.
I would just like to add to that. So I think that the one thing that all of those cities that you listed have in common is that they're all very expensive and getting more expensive, and housing is getting more and more expensive, and people are getting turned out onto the streets more and more. And I think that's the reason why you would see an increase in homeless population, an increase in encampments. It doesn't really make any sense just from an intuitive level that ordinances or lessening ordinances would contribute to growing homelessness, because what we're doing is criminalizing behavior that people can't help. You can give somebody as many tickets as you want. There's no way that criminalizing it is going to make them less homeless. You can't, they don't have any other choice. The whole point of it is that they don't have anywhere to go. So if you're giving them a ticket for behavior they can't help, then there's no way that they're going to suddenly stop being homeless. So I think that that's just the sort of underlying intuitive point for why we need to repeal them, because there's no way that they're helping. In fact, they're actually hurting, because it means that people have warrants and can't get housing.
I hear what you're saying. I'm just trying to get some more information out there, because I think there is, folks are pointing to Seattle and they're making claims, and it just would be really helpful to be, if there is research or if there is analysis that's already done, to be able to kind of separate out what is just the lack of housing, which is the problem in terms of folks experiencing homelessness, versus what is changes in the ordinance here. So if other office already has that information, I would appreciate being pointed in the right direction.
And we've looked at that some, and I'll be happy to share some of that with you.
Councilmember Kitchen.
I was just going to say, Councilmember Alter, there might be information out of the National Alliance to End Homelessness that might be helpful there about the differences in some of these other cities where they may not have, or the challenges they've experienced with regard to that third area we've been talking about, and that's the available, the place for someone to be. I would suspect that that's really the place, that's really the area that these other cities have a lot of challenges with and have not grappled with. We are in a situation, I think someone said earlier, we're in a situation in our city, I think it was Councilmember Tovo, that we can still get ahead of the curve. We're a number of years behind these other cities, and so we have an opportunity to address those things. So I will ask the National Alliance if they can help us answer that question. I'm hearing those same kinds of concerns. So, and I think it's a question that perhaps there's data that they can share with us. And then the last thing I wanted to say is I wanted to thank every one of you, as well as everyone else who's talked today. These are conversations we have to have, and I think I want to thank you all for continuing to push and to continuing to raise the questions of values and morals that you have, because as a community we have an opportunity in Austin to really align what we're doing with what we believe, and we know that we're not doing that now. So I just wanted to say thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
As we close this section out, and just as we're about to go into executive session, two things. First is, with respect to this, I think this was time. I know this took a lot of time for us to go through. Didn't anticipate it would take this long, but I think it's going to make next week's work that much easier. And my hope is that just as we've seen with each one of the groups that have come here today, from top to bottom, everybody is trying to work on what is the crucial issue. People have made suggestions. We've been able to tailor this and move this increasingly toward what is really at issue. My hope is that we can keep the conversation now in the community on what do we do with the third bucket, and that we won't be having people in the community that are confused, to think that we're talking about in any way removing impediments that protect public health and public safety, that we're doing anything in any way that is associated with removing protections from being cursed at or screamed or touched or blocked the passage, that's not what this council is considering doing. And if we can keep everybody focused on the really difficult question that we do have, I think we'll be better off. Mr. Scar, you want to?
No, if you wanted to continue, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I was going to move to something else. Yes?
Especially if Councilmember Kassar is going to make concluding remarks. I just have a question for our chief while we're having this conversation. It's a quick one, though. In looking at the data, and again, I think it's important to ask this today and not wait, because I'm trying to clarify what the various proposals we have before us would and would not do, and I appreciate that our staff and our legal staff are going to kind of help us understand that in a way that we can put out to the public as well. In looking at in the 2017 and the 2018 data for solicitation, I see it's broken down by categories. So aggressive solicitation, for example, in 2017 there were 45 instances of it. Solicitation without a food permit, 1. Solicitation by pedestrian and roadway was 84. I mean, the biggest category of solicitation are actually individuals in roadways. And so those that fall under the state law in 2017 were 151. In 2018, it was 52. Do those remain or not remain with the proposals we have before us? On the state level, I would assume those remain.
Correct. On the state level, we will be dealing with the state law for pedestrian in the roadway, and these ordinances would not do anything to change that. Under the changes to the aggressive solicitation ordinance that will now change to aggressive confrontation, again, if that behavior still meets the parameters since they didn't change, that would still be a tool that would be available to the officers.
Okay, but in terms of just general solicitation by pedestrian and roadway under city ordinance, which again were the bulk of, there were about twice as many of those as there were aggressive solicitations in 2017, and then in 2018 there were about 47 of those again. It seems to me, based on my understanding of the amendment that the amended ordinance that the mayor brought forward, those would no longer be offenses. Solicitation in a roadway would not be an offense unless it was aggressive, unless it fell into the parameters of aggressive confrontation.
Correct. We'd be left with the state law for pedestrian in a roadway.
Okay. And can you help me understand why somebody would get a citation under a city ordinance rather than a state? Does it just deal with the roads? Which roads they're soliciting on, or?
No, I think it would more deal with the elements that were present. In other words, the pedestrian, the roadway is due to the danger of being in that roadway versus the ordinance on solicitation. You might not feel that the danger was the same. In other words, maybe it's a residential slower speed versus when they're doing it on the frontage roads and all of that. So it's really an officer's discretion on whether they feel that the conduct is unsafe and dangerous versus that it's violation of the solicitation as outlined.
Gotcha. Okay. If we could just make sure that gets folded into the memo that staff are doing as well, that component of understanding that. But so if I understand what you're saying, it's sort of based on the danger of the road. If it's a dangerous situation, they're more likely to get a ticket under the state ordinance versus just the behavior of soliciting. If it's just the behavior of the soliciting that's causing the concern, they would more likely get a violation under the city ordinance, which would go away under the measures we're contemplating.
I believe that's what you're seeing based on officers' judgment. Again, I'm speaking for what I believe the officers
Right.
are giving consideration to when they're making the decision of whether to apply law or ordinance.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I think it's, anyway, thank you for breaking down the solicitation in this way. I think it helps us, have a fuller conversation about it.
Councilor Kassar.
I just appreciate everybody's time today and everybody that spoke, and the chief taking so many of our questions and the city attorney taking mine yesterday. Mayor, I know you kind of wrapped it up, but I really want to be really clear. I mean, we have an editorial written in a couple of days ago, an editorial from this morning, and I think what we've concluded is that everybody's intent here is the same on these points. Folks asked whether or not this would allow people to be frighteningly accosted. The fact of the matter is nobody here intends to change that, and everybody has been clear that what was posted wouldn't change that, And with what you've decided to change, we could make it doubly clear if we wanted to. The same thing applies to people being able to do whatever they wanted in parks. That people saying this is going to let you do whatever you want in parks, that isn't true. That a person would now be allowed to curse or scream or touch you or block your passage or follow you threateningly. That is written in an editorial. That we established on Tuesday is not true, and with what you've suggested to make it doubly belt and suspenders, not true. Some folks wrote in an editorial this morning that it could scrap prohibitions on aggressive activity. I think we've all established that's not only the intent, but not true. That people could be aggressive around ATMs. Again, not true. That people could be followed threateningly or grabbed, or there could be abusive language. Again, that is not anybody's intent. And I think it was established by the attorney on Tuesday, not true. And by your language that you've handed out, trying to make it really clearly not true. But what is true is that we have ordinances on the books that say it is a criminal violation for you to sleep in your car. And we have a lot of AISD students who every night sleep in their car. We're saying it's a criminal violation for you to ask for money peacefully at 7:30 at night. That is, we just know that that's just not right. And we have to figure out what it is we do about that. I appreciate all of council's work to do something about that. I actually thought I wanted to be a high school teacher before I got more into organizing and into politics. And one of my favorite students that I was helping co-teach, I recognized that no matter how hard we tried, there was nothing you could do to change the fact that she was getting driven to school in the same car she slept in at night. And it's just not right for us to say that that is a criminal violation of the law. And that's a hard conversation for us to have. But I appreciate that it seems like there's just so much energy and thought and compassion going into figuring out how it is that we help with that situation, not calling it a criminal offense, still taking into account everybody's public safety, but not making things worse for her. So thank you all.
Thank you.